We are here on the Hill Climbers Show, and we've got a very special guest today. Joe Wentzell is our first world champion cyclist on the show. So Joe's got a lot more to his story that we'll get into in a lot of detail. But yeah, this is just a milestone for us. I mean, we're doing this cycling and business show, and we've been doing it for a couple years now and 15 episodes. And just to have Joe aboard with the experience of being a world champion and in his event, it's just a pleasure. So Joe, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, guys. I'm really excited to speak with you some more and really enjoy this podcast that you put together since meeting you and getting a chance to listen to some of your episodes. I dig it. So I'm excited to be on here. Thank you.
We often give the softball question to start these interviews. And how did you start riding bikes? What is the story from childhood? And then how'd you start getting competitive?
At about the age of, I guess I was 8, we moved into a house that was on a farmland, and I had a cousin that lived next door to me. I had another neighbor that was close by, and we had a bike gang. I mean, we rode on dirt trails through farmland on our bikes, and we pretended to be cops and robbers and, all of that stuff on our bicycles. And I got older. I, started to build ramps, and do all those things. And it even got into racing BMX as I was approaching middle school and through middle school. Had friends that were on bikes, and we were just on them all the time. And literally, it's funny, you'll see a lot of TikTok about what it was like to be Gen X growing up, right? Well, I'm Gen X, and yeah, I mean, we really left the house in the morning in the summertime and came back, around dinner time and, covered in dirt. I can remember my sisters making fun of how dirty and smelly I was, but we had a great time out unsupervised and playing on our bikes.
We're going to launch into your career, your cycling career, etc. But what were you like as a kid? What sports was probably a theme, I'd imagine.
No, I never considered myself an athlete. It's funny, right? Like I was riding bikes, I was racing BMX, but I didn't identify as an athlete until into high school, probably. And I had a couple of really great people that saw something in me and convinced me to try out for sports. I played baseball as a kid. It was the only youth sport that existed in Elmer at the time, and I was horrible. I don't know that I ever got a hit. So I was really bad at baseball. And
well, I didn't know this part of your background. How did you then transition into football?
In 8th grade, we had this football coach, and he was a shop teacher, Ed Denton. And I remember this day, and I think about it a lot. He came to me, and I was over 6 foot when I was in 8th grade already. And he's like, "What are you going to do next year?" And I'm like, "I don't know. What do you mean? What am I going to do next year?" He goes, "Are you going to play any sports?" And I said, I hadn't given it any thought. He goes, "Well, how about you come out for the football team?" And I'm like, "I never played football." And he's like, "That doesn't matter. We'll teach you what to do." That conversation changed my life in a lot of ways, right? Developed a friendship and relationship with this teacher and coach that helped guide a lot of my goals through high school. He was the first person that ever put college on my radar. Like that wasn't, I'm the first person from my family to graduate from college, to go to college and graduate from college. And so it wasn't on my radar that I could, direction my life could take. And so joined the football team, had similar experience with other sports. I wrestled in high school. I track and field. So through the shot put, discus, I was a big kid. I played offense and defensive lineman through high school and through college. But, I was really fortunate, right? Great teachers and coaches at that time that encouraged me, molded me, taught me a lot about, how to be an athlete, what it was to be an athlete, how to set goals, how to go out, all of those things, right?
I have a couple of things to comment on. One is that, especially in business and entrepreneurship, for someone, an influential person to say, it's okay that you've never done this before, it's worth giving a shot. to
Mm-hmm.
someone who was 12 or 13 years old. I think that just strikes me as a really fundamentally important lesson for someone like you in the career that you had. And then the other one is that I have an 8-month-old baby boy, and my wife and I have been reading a book that's about 100 pages called Raising Boys. And
Mm-hmm.
in one of the first chapters, it talks about the importance of having male mentors right at that age that are not your father, because inevitably you're going to have some friction with your father. And it's just we're animals. It's just how we develop.
Mm-hmm.
So to have another role model there in the picture is really fundamentally important for development. And then you mentioned this was an individual who encouraged you to go to college.
But I consider myself extremely fortunate for those relationships. And also, my parents had great work ethic and put family first. I remember a conversation with my mom because she worked at a factory, and at times I was like, "Why does my mom work at a factory? Why isn't she at an office like other moms?" And she's like, "I can clock out at the end of the day, and I never have to think about my job until I go back, and I'm 100% here with the kids." And I remember that conversation, and it still stands out to me how important that is. And I have two older sisters who, we were a tight family, and still are. My parents have since passed, but I'm still very close with my sisters. So really fortunate to have, that kind of support. I do want to mention some other coaches because
Yeah.
I want to share this podcast out. But Mike McGowan, Dale Driver, Vince Taglione, and Al DiGiulio, all high school coaches of mine that I still think about those guys and the great job they did.
In your teenage years and then early adulthood, you played all of these different sports, and I imagine during this time you ended up hitting the gym, hitting the weight room, and really
Mm-hmm.
training up for these different disciplines, whether that's track and field or playing on two different sides of the ball, etc. Do you have anything to share about your level of interest in the training aspect of these sports? Was that something you glommed onto and excelled at? Was it a different story? How did that go?
Yeah, I did. I spent a lot of time in the weight room, and it's funny. I also spent a lot of time hating the way my body looked. Um,
Okay.
I was tall, I was heavy, so I didn't fit in.
And
It wasn't the norm.
what weight are we talking about? Let's say going into college, let's say.
I think I went into college. I was probably around 250 pounds. That
Hmm.
wasn't from a football perspective and an offensive lineman perspective. I was light. Personally, I didn't like the way my body looked, and I lifted weights. I felt like I tried to change my body all the time and put a lot of time into it. But on that point, I also would read a lot, would kind of absorb as much as I could get a hold of as far as training advice. And at that time, there wasn't a lot. I mean, strength and conditioning wasn't a big part of college athletics, or was just starting to become a big part of college athletics in the 80s. I graduated high school in 89. A lot of what we were consuming were, kind of bodybuilding, magazines and things like that. But I would write workouts for myself. I would have, friends wanting me to work out with me or write workouts for them. So I was writing workouts in eighth grade and going to a gym that was in some guy in the small town of Elmer's basement, and he had like literally a collection box where every month you were supposed to drop in your $10 dues to work out in this guy's
That's old
basement.
school.
Like that, that's
Yeah.
old school, right? So
Yeah.
that's where I was working out. Yeah, the training piece has always been important. It's something that I gravitated to, and I think one of the reasons why in my first role out of college was as a strength and conditioning coach. And having absorbed all that, having understood how it can benefit someone as an athlete, and also really coming to terms with not everybody's meant to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and you can be a great athlete and not look like a bodybuilder. And that was something that I learned through my own trial and error and working with other people.
I'm really glad that you shared that and brought that up, just about your body image and that motivating your decision to train and hit the weights, because I think I think cycling, like, so I identify with that as well. And I don't think it's a big surprise that I ended up choosing cycling as my lifestyle, basically, because I really like staying lean. I like part of the physique that comes with it. So it's a dovetailing
Mm-hmm.
of my body image, mentality, and also the workouts that I like that'll achieve that for me. And I think it's probably not talked about enough with men. It's okay, so someone who's maybe skinny or scrawny wants to go to the gym to bulk up, but that's not the only scenario. So Joe, I wanted you to share the story about how you yourself got back into riding, and then we can talk about your career getting into competitive cycling.
Okay, yeah, this is a fun story. It actually brings back a lot of good memories. You hear the stories of the struggling poor graduate student, and that was definitely me. And I had moved off campus and wanted to be able to get to work reliably and cost effectively. And I pulled out my BMX bike from my parents' basement and started riding my old BMX bike. It was a 24-inch wheel, so a cruiser division in BMX Hutch Pro Star. I'm still sorry to this day that I sold that bike because it was a really cool bike. It was all chrome.
Funny choice for a commuter bike. I mean, I can just picture you on your BMX riding through North Philadelphia.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
awesome. Yeah.
6'3", and at that time, when I graduated college, I was 6'3", 285 pound, riding this, kids BMX bike. But I remember grabbing onto the side of buses or trash trucks to get a free ride down Broad Street. But, in my graduate program was sports administration. One of the classes was holding a fundraiser. They had brought in a bunch of silent auction items. And one of those silent auction items was a Trek 820 mountain bike, rigid, fork on the front, so no suspension. But I bid on it because I realized, this BMX bike was not going to be the best way to commute around forever. And mountain biking in the mid '90s was a thing, and we were being bombarded with Mountain Dew ads, right? So I got this mountain bike at the silent auction, and not long after that, I had a neighbor. I saw a group of people outside of his apartment and lived down the street from me. Went over to them, introduced myself, and they invited me on a mountain bike ride. And I jumped at the opportunity. I saw how they were dressed, right? 25, I guess, at the time, or 23 at the time. And I'm like, oh, I got to dress the part, kind of, but I don't have bike shorts and all these things, right? So I had a pair of football pants. I cut them off into shorts, but they were tight, Lycra, and went out on a t-shirt and an old BMX helmet that I still had, and went biking with these guys in the Wissahickon in Philadelphia, which is an amazing place to ride. I actually, story for another day, but the house we live in, I bought because it's on the trails of the Wissahickon. But that was my first ride. It was a Wednesday night after work. You guys see me, I'm smiling cheek to cheek because I'm thinking about that first ride and coming back, having fallen off my bike with skinned up knees, dirty, exhausted, and but I was hooked. It was I was still wanting to train. Cycling gave me that, plus it gave me this ability to compete with myself. How do I make myself better and have competition as part of my schema that drove me for the last, the previous 10 years.
And in a whole other category, it's not adding more weight to the barbell. It's adding speed, right?
Yeah.
In a entirely different cardio category.
Yeah, absolutely. Because all the things that can make someone good at playing football, and I would say I was good, but not great. I wasn't someone that was on the path to the NFL, but I was a good football player and a strong guy. Cyclists can benefit from that strength more so than Franco than probably a runner can. And it's funny. One of the ways I try to explain bike racing to someone and how it might differ from running. If you were to compare a long bike race to a marathon, for instance, right? Marathon is all about expending all the energy you can for the length of time right up until the end. So pacing is extremely important, and overpacing can be a detriment. Underpacing can be a detriment. Pacing perfectly, so at the very end of the marathon, you've expended all your energy. So in bike racing, right, you might, in the course of a 5 hour race, you might have your peak 5 second power, your peak 1 minute power, your peak 20 minute power. In marathon running, you would never expect a marathoner to have their best 100 meter time, best 200 meter time, best 400 meter time, right? But in a cycling race, you have such high intensity and then periods of nothing and recover. Very different disciplines. And, it's always helped me to explain those differences, especially when someone might be coming over from running and wanting to get into cycling, which is really common in the master's level. I used to joke that all runners eventually have to become cyclists because of overuse injuries. But, that's the difference, right?
Yeah, what came to mind when you're describing that marathon conservation of energy is a term my coach would say a lot is like run your own race, run your own race. And as I approached cycling over the last 3-4 years and had that mentality, I'd get dropped every ride because I'd let the group go and then quickly realize, holy crap, now I have all this wind in my face. I'm never going to get back up there. And yeah, competing in cycling is much more tactical in that sense where like you kind of have to run the race that's being ridden around you and you can't really make your choices all the time. So having those reserves, having that strength is super important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so you've started riding, you've started training cycling. You then at some point decide to start a bike shop, right? And we're curious what the story, how did that come about?
Yeah, the getting into retail, that was a big leap. I worked a little bit of bicycle retail on some, weekend and some summer things. When I left from being a strength and conditioning coach, I had a brief stay as a teacher. Had some summers off. I worked at a bike shop. A good friend of mine to this day, Chris Foster, at a shop, peddler shop in South Jersey. Learned a little bit about retail, mostly worked there to learn how to work on bikes. At the same time, I had started to have some success in bike racing. I went from that first mountain bike ride to then competing in mountain bike races, competing in road races, progressing through the categories from a 5 to a Cat 2 over the course of one season, right? So it just was finding a lot of success in the road racing,
all in,
crit racing specifically, all in. And people started asking, what do you know about training? Like, can you work with me? And I started working with a couple of athletes, a couple of female athletes initially who were competing at the time. I had started to teach spinning classes, indoor cycling classes on a spinning bike, and thought about combining spinning classes with structured periodized training and bought a bunch of trainers. At the time, there weren't a lot of options of things that could measure power, but there was one from Cat that allowed you to mount your bike on, front fork on the trainer and had a trainer that did an adequate job of managing or recording power.
And Joe, we're talking at this point like mid 90s, mid to later 90s. I was just wondering how prevalent was spinning classes back then? Were they starting to gain buzz? Was it already kind of a mainstream phenomenon? One of the reasons I ask is because what you're referring to as far as cobbling together a spin studio with a power meter and bringing cyclists in to work out together, let's say structured workouts, it seemed really, really pioneering. Were any other folks doing what you had conceived?
No, I don't know if there's a history that really tracks this stuff, but I'd like to think I'm at least one of the first. Cat had developed this trainer, so there must have been some, sense of this. I think CompuTrainers were developed around this time. SRM had one power meter that was out there that only the best tour riders were buying and using, right? It wasn't something that every cyclist had. Most cyclists in 1996, when this was happening, never heard of power, right? The rowing ergometer was very good at measuring your power, your speed data very accurately. So having learned about that through working with the Temple rowers and Gavin White at the time, I developed a schema around how to utilize this as a training tool. And so I bought a bunch of these Cat trainers and got some space at a local gym in Philadelphia called Sweat Gym. The owner allowed us to utilize that space late at night, right? When all the other aerobic classes were done, we would set up these trainers at 8 p.m. And I had a group of people that would come in, and it was amazing how many people wanted to do it and learn. And we did a 12-week
periodized program, and I was very structured the way I would work with a college athlete, but I'm working with adults at lots of different ages, lots of different abilities. We would start off with a power test, and then we would build out periodized training that was very specific to the individual. And I used to describe it as like you could have a world-class athlete and a first-time athlete can do the same class just at very different intensities that are designed for each individual. Yeah, and that became the genesis of what was my kind of coaching business. And a few years into that, had an opportunity at some retail space and decided it was a great mix to combine bicycle retail with bicycle training and coaching. That's when Breakaway Bikes was conceived, and we had a retail location and first floor was retail, second floor was a training studio. Expanded the class offering. They no longer had to be at 8 o'clock at night. They could be early mornings.
Joe, that's how you know you were onto something, when you had an oversubscribed class at 8 p.m. That's when you know you got a good product, right?
Right. Probably didn't even equate that at the time, but what I saw were people were getting results. And at the time in Philadelphia, you would have the winter doldrums, right? People would get in shape all season long, and then over the winter they would lose all their cycling fitness and then start again in the spring. And this gave people a structured approach to not only maintaining fitness but gaining fitness in a really specific way that helped them into the spring.
Just to give you props, I've lived in a few cities, and I think Breakaway is the only one that had a training center, only bike shop that had a training center connected to it. I don't think I've ever heard of that from another bike shop, and it sounds like a great part of the business model for selling bikes and bike parts and kits, right? To have a studio built right into the shop. So back to launching the business, what gave you the confidence to go in and start your, I guess, did you say you bought the bike shop or did you start it from scratch?
I started it from scratch. It didn't exist. Ignorance is probably bliss, right?
Heard that one before. Yeah.
I didn't know what I didn't know. And, but I remember, as I was finishing up undergrad, really wanting to have my own business. And, my dad had a side hustle before the side hustle was really a term, right? So, and he had grown up his dad had a tree nursery growing trees, and my dad lived on some farmland, right? So it was part of that tree nursery, and my dad kind of ran that part-time while he was also a truck driver. And I saw, he was really good at it and liked it, never was in a position to take the leap of faith and make it his full-time thing.
What a wholesome side hustle. Man, that sounds great. Yeah.
Hard, but there was something that I want to prove my parents wrong. I'm going to do it better. I can do something that he wasn't able to do. Mm-hmm. That kind of mentality was in the background, I think, driving me to start my own business. By the time, decided to really go full in from training athletes, which was a side hustle for me, to let me make this a full-time thing and combine it with retail. I mean, I just had met my wife, we got married, and she was extremely supportive, both from a emotional standpoint and encouragement standpoint, but also financially. She was working, and we were in a position that we could take this leap. And so it just made sense, and it was worthwhile. I mean, it was a great, experience for me, and a wonderful 17 years.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. 17 years, incredible. And by the way, for the record, I did take the RPM class for at least one, I think it was 12-week session, because I think the program did continue that way, right? They were 12-week blocks. Yeah.
Yeah, I really wanted to keep the periodized schedule of these 3-4 week blocks of training in the program, and we maintain that.
So a couple things. One is this was my first year riding bikes, and I was so excited to do the RPM class because my brother-in-law Mike Gallagher had been talking about it, and it was awesome. But the coach would say, like, let's stay at 70% or whatever, 80% for this workout. And younger Sam just didn't comprehend how this was going to help me get faster in the long term. Like it just didn't compute. So yeah, it took me a few years to realize the values of the zones and zone 2 training.
Yeah.
But then the other thing I was going to say is I did buy my first 2 bikes from you guys. So the community aspect, and Joe and I talked a little bit about this before, was real. I mean, I was friendly with the guys in the shop. I still follow them on Strava and exchange comments once in a while. And I trusted them with these huge initial purchases. I mean, spending, thousands of dollars on bikes for the first time is a big hurdle to get over. I have very fond memories of the shop. And I think if I did, then hundreds of thousands of people in and around Philadelphia had the same experience. So it's a big deal.
That's nice to hear. An interesting thing about the shop, I think if there's any central theme in this, right, it's relationships. So we bought this building. It was essentially a shell. We had to build it out, and we were bootstrapping our company. Literally bootstrapping, meaning, hey, we're, taking money from sales today, and we're going to go buy some wood so we can finish building out the studio upstairs. And that ultimately leads to, hey, it's time to pay our vendors, and man, we can't pay our vendors, right? And so I remember there were a couple of companies, CEOs that I called because their credit departments were breathing down my neck. And Scott Montgomery at Scott Bikes at the time, Scott Montgomery's dad had founded Cannondale Bikes, right? And Scott's been in the business a long time. Remember my conversation with Scott? Scott, I promise you're going to get paid. And I think this speaks a little bit about growing up in a small town of Elmer, and that I was going to call these people and just promise them you're going to get paid. You need a little bit more time. We bought this building. We're building it out. Not borrowed money to do this. We're making it happen. That same conversation with Pat Kinane, who eventually hired me at Advanced Sports after I'd sold Breakaway. They were another vendor of ours. Like all of these people I made that phone call to, and all of them said, we believe in you. We trust you. We're going to extend it. Things are going to be okay. And, got through it. But that was one of the most difficult times in our business, right? Because we went from this smaller location that we controlled our expenses, and we had grown it, to now we're in this bigger spot. We own this building, but and revenue was ramping rapidly. I mean, I think our first year sales were 300,000. When I left Breakaway in 2016, we were at 2.5 million in sales. So, which is a good number. I mean, that's the kind of number that gets you into the top 100, bicycle retailers in the country. That I think there's, a lot of bike shops would say, I would love to be at $2 million in revenue. And we were.
Incredible. And so during this time, at some point, you decide to start training and competing seriously in track, right? How did that come about?
Yeah, our track happens to be a little far away from where I live in Philadelphia. It's an 1.5 to 2 hour commute. So I didn't spend a lot of time there. And it wasn't until my kids were a little older, they were doing some cycling events, and I had started to coach them in bike racing at the track, and we were making treks up there as a family.
And this is Allentown?
This is in Allentown, yeah. There's a town called Trexlertown, and this is the Valley Preferred Cycling Center that has existed there since the 60s and has just a tremendous history of cycling talent. We've had several Olympians come out of there. Marty Nostine, well known for Olympic gold medalist in the sprint category in 1996, and a world champion track cyclist. Bobby Lee, who was one of our male Olympians, kind of grew up in that track.
And by the way, a bit of a tangent here, but Bradley Wiggins has just been all over Lance Armstrong's podcasts. And so recently I've done sort of a dive into the British program and how it hatches the careers of these Tour de France winners. And it's something that, like, just looking at a track and then looking at a 21-day stage race, you don't see the connection. And it's just awesome. I was listening to another podcast, shout out to the EF Pro, basically coaching podcast. And I think it's called The Power Meter Show or podcast. And they were talking about how track, if you have access, can be the number one weapon in a road cyclist, toolkit. And here most road cyclists are probably have never been on a track.
One of the reasons why I think track cycling can accelerate a cyclist's growth is because I could go up on a Saturday and race the Masters races and get 4 or 5 chances at practicing a race finish. Essentially is what track cycling is, right? They're really short, condensed, high intensity finishes.
And Joe, to educate myself and listeners, a typical fast scratch race is how long?
They can be as short as 3 kilometers, as long as 10 kilometers, sometimes even longer. I'll say, the average speed is, probably close to 30 miles an hour.
Yeah. And for the scratch race, is that starting line, everyone has the same position on the start? How does that work?
Yeah. So depending on the type of track, like a track like T-Town, which is a 333 meter kind of old style outdoor track, everyone will line up on the wall just kind of randomly and hold on to the wall and start. It can start of various ways. There's no real, hey, here's your position. It's just,
Right.
Start, and everyone kind of bunches together, and then the race starts to unfold.
Can you share some of your strategy? Like how does it compare to road riding? What are some of the similarities, or if there are more differences, what are the differences?
I think there's a lot more similarities, and it's why, one of the first things I said about the track, right, is you can go and race 4 or 5 races in a session at the track and get that many times to practice tactics, as well as develop a different level of fitness than you would get from road training. When I decided to go to Worlds, I thought I better just try my best shot at the pursuit, which is not a mass start event. It's just, you versus another rider, and really a time trial for time. So I really trained for this 3 kilometer pursuit, thinking that was my best shot at a World's medal. And I ultimately didn't medal in the pursuit, but I was really well trained for 3 kilometers. So when I went into the scratch race, I thought, I'm going to use that training, knowing that 3 kilometers is what I've really ramped my training up for, to look for an opportunity in the scratch race. And the scratch race, which is probably equally won by a match sprint as it is as in a breakaway, I thought I need to be in a breakaway. I need to reduce the size. I need to do that. And so I thought, I'm going to look for an opportunity with 3 kilometers to go, or around that time, to try to break away. And our race went off, and there was a 5 or 6 person break from early on that had been out there and had gained a lot of distance on the field, never lapping the field, but gained at least half a track on the field. And there was a guy in our race who had won multiple world championships, had set the world record in the pursuit, and he was still in the peloton with me, and I'm watching him and seeing what he does. And he grew impatient and tried to bring back that break. And he took a massive, few lap pull. He pulled up track looking for other people to help. No one else helped. And I took that opportunity to jump and bridge across to the break. And I was able to bridge across to the break. And then when I got to the break and bridged across, they were both tired and probably not feeling having someone else in there, and none of them worked with me. So I attacked the break and had to go solo for about 2 kilometers, but was able to lap the field in that move. And so that was how I ended up winning that world championship. So, and I'd say one of the best things about cycling for me is, look, I'm not the fastest guy, and I wasn't the fastest guy out there. Probably don't have the most endurance as some of the people I'm competing with. But cycling, unlike, and Franco, you probably experienced this with running, you better be in the best shape if you're going to win your race, right? And with cycling, there's the tactical piece that you don't have to be the fastest or strongest to win. It's a combination. You need those things. But when you add the extreme tactical piece to it, you don't have to be the fastest and strongest to win at bike racing.
What a great story. Thanks for sharing that with us. And just incredible that you trained for the pursuit, right? I mean, that would a kind of curveball there. Taking one step back, we didn't really talk about, okay, Joe decides he wants to compete at the national level. You won a national championship, and then obviously qualified for Worlds. How did you go about the training?
Yeah, I went into that season, and the only thing that was on my radar was I knew track nationals was going to happen in T-Town. It was important for me that I, was going to compete on the national level. I really didn't want to commit vacation time and all of these things, right, to going away somewhere, but it was in my backyard and somewhere that I trained, and my kids raced at the track. I decided, I want to give that a shot. And that year I went into, as far as my training was concerned, planning for that national championship, which took place in July. I wanted to cut some weight. I actually, first time as an adult that I made a concerted effort to say, I'm not drinking any alcohol, zero. And I had bought a bottle of Belgian beer. I think it was a Duvel, and I put it in my refrigerator. And I said, I'm going to open that after I win my first race this year. And, I was training and started to race some crits and road races in the spring. And I think around June, I won my first race. And I opened up the fridge. I'm like, I'm going to crack open this bottle. And I looked at it and I'm going, you know what? I'm not going to open it until after I win the national championships. And so I closed the fridge and then, kept on my training and went to nationals, and I won the points race. And actually, in a lot of ways, more proud of that points race because, the quality of the competition, I won't say it was necessarily a better competition, but I knew all the competition. They were all Americans, right? And there were some great names in that race, people that had raced professionally, people had raced in the Olympics that were racing as masters. And to win that points race against that competition, I was like, holy cow, I can do this at this level. I had not competed at a national level before, but here I did. I walked away with a national jersey, and I did come back and I opened up my fridge and I made the call in that moment. I looked at that bottle of Duval and I said, I'm not going to drink that thing until I win the world championship. I eventually got to drink that bottle, but I went that year and had no alcohol. And that was probably the first time I did it, and then, have dabbled in
one of the ancillary benefits, it sounds like, to the training program. Yeah. So, we haven't really dove into your career after Breakaway. Two-part question. I'd love to hear about the transition of how you kind of got into the corporate world, setting up sales teams, and then how you go about your job professionally with this background you have, putting together strategic plans, executing them. And I'm just wondering how you think about the parallels, if there are any parallels.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And as you ask it, it's funny how going through a podcast, a show like this, and getting asked questions, how things that I didn't think about leading into this come to mind. While I had Breakaway, one of the things that I attempted to do with a group of people was to build an indoor cycling center in Philadelphia. And it's called Project 250. And at the time, become friends with Michael Nutter, who was the mayor of Philadelphia. His wife is an avid cyclist, races on the track, has won national championships. I got to know them really well. And we were trying to build a track. It was a multi-use indoor facility that would have had a track as a centerpiece, but also functioned as other things. Ultimately didn't go through, but through that process, I began sitting on a cycling advisory board at the city and got to meet some great people. And I mentioned, if there's a theme to this podcast, it's at least my portion here. It's just some of the relationships that have been forged over a career or a life. One of the people had been on that advisory board was Pat Kinane, who I'd mentioned earlier. He was the CEO of Advanced Sports at the time. Got to know him and become more and more friendly. And they were a vendor of ours, so we were purchasing equipment from them. When I had made the decision to exit Breakaway, it was Lisa Nutter who said, why don't you talk to Pat if you're looking for continuing to work? And I never thought about doing that. And I did. I met with Pat. And at the time, they were looking at acquiring Performance Bicycles, who was their largest customer at the time and who had fallen on some tough financial times. And, his company did all wholesale. I had run a successful retail business. We saw a good fit of how some of what I've learned in retail could benefit them as they're acquiring a large retail chain. So through that relationship, and then Pat was just phenomenal leader, not only incredibly knowledgeable about the entire bicycle supply chain and industry, but also just someone that led with just great empathy and understanding, and someone consider a huge role model in how I would want to be as a developing leader. And so went to work with Pat and had a really good couple of years. Thought we had some really strong initiatives and had some good momentum, but ultimately not enough to salvage performance bicycles, which had fallen on some tough times, and went through this Chapter 11 restructuring, and ended up closing all the retail stores. I wasn't needed anymore after that process. And interesting enough, bikes being at the center of things, I was contacted by a guy who had worked at Performance Bicycles years ago, and he had started a cannabis business and was expanding and won some licenses in PA, and was brought in to, well, we got to talking, and he ended up hiring me as a regional director to run these dispensaries in Pennsylvania. And at the core and the connection was their retail, right? And retail is a type of business that I understood, and it was really, I needed to learn a bit about the product, but really found a lot of similarities in the customers. And through that, used that as a kind of a guide to me on how to run these retail dispensaries, and they were wildly successful dispensaries. We ended up selling them to another multi-state operator, publicly traded company, for $96 million. So it was a very successful retail operation out of Pennsylvania that we ran.
Very cool. Yeah, I didn't know the success story of that exit. That's a nice juicy number. But as far as getting familiar with the product, you had mentioned you made it sort of part of your training regimen. Can you share a little bit about kind of your leaning into those products and your workouts?
Yeah, absolutely. And Franco, you might like this. There's a book called Runner's High. I think that the author's name is Josiah Hess, called Runner's High. And I read this book, and I'm working in this industry, and I have a lot of passionate employees that are telling me how much cannabis has helped them for medical reasons, for anxiety reasons. And I'm like, I've never really experimented with cannabis. And Sam, you and I had shared this when we talked earlier. I mean, I was in college. I was playing a sport that we were tested regularly. So I never dabbled in it. And here I am working in the industry, wanting to learn more. And I read this book called Runner's High. And it was about ultra distance trail runners using microdosage of cannabis as part of their kind of training regimen, and making, running a little bit more of an elevated experience, if you will, right? So I started to dabble in it myself, and still do, right? So I find indoor training is great with a little microdose of some cannabis before sitting on a trainer and spinning my wheels in front of a Zwift screen for a couple hours. Yeah, it makes a huge difference to the work.
I just thought it was fascinating because a lot of people complain about trainer workouts, whether they do them. A lot of people just don't do it. They just kind of refuse to. So what a nice little hack. I personally have not tried it, but yeah, I mean, if you've got a 2-hour session that you're planning, I mean, those are difficult sessions to get through. So
the music sounds better. The visuals are more tolerable. Like it's just
keeps it interesting.
It makes the couple hours fly by.
So cool. More recently, you've joined Talaria. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, Talaria. And actually, met this group. I was a customer of theirs when I was running the other cannabis business, and so it was an opportunity. That dynamic company, it's growing. It's actually two businesses. The CEO founded Talaria, which originated as a product transportation business, specifically in the cannabis space. And then that grew into a second business called National Secure Transport, which is a cash and transit company. And that has grown outside of cannabis, where we service traditional retail and support the banking industry and getting the cash ecosystem into the banking world through cash and transit couriers. So similar to a Brinks or a Loomis or a Garda that you would have probably heard of.
Another interesting business that you've gotten involved with. And I wanted to come back to that second part of the question. Franco and I are here. We've done the research on your accolades, and we're just wondering, is there anything you bring to being a big business executive that you think can be attributed to your skills, to what you developed, training yourself, training other athletes, strategic, regimented approach to achieving your goals? Do you see similarities between your business career and your athletic career?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think goals are, probably at the center of that. And I think goal setting has been essential for me to stay focused and have the successes that I've had, right? It's from setting a goal and then trying to break down how to reach that goal. And then as a head of revenue, constantly doing that. I'm in the middle of doing that now, planning for next year. It's important to, there's setting the goal, making that goal realistic and something that you can achieve. And I think really any goal within reason can be achieved, but then breaking it down and really recognizing, I think this is important as an athlete and as a business, what you're willing to do to get to that goal. What are you willing to invest as an athlete? What time are you willing to invest in all the training? What kind of discipline in your lifestyle are you willing to invest?
The word that comes to mind is sacrifice.
Yeah, sacrifice.
Yeah.
I mean, I tend to try to stay away from sacrifice just personally from me, because I want to think of this as I'm not taking away from my life. I want to be adding to it. So what am I going to invest? Am I going to invest in more sleep? That might mean that I don't stay up as late, right? You could look at that as a sacrifice, or you could look at it as what am I adding to my life, right? So sorry to take away from the word sacrifice, but
I thought that was a great spin on it, Joe. I mean, this is exactly why we asked you this question. So that was a great answer.
And I think in business you have to do the same thing. What am I willing to invest, right? Am I and can I afford that investment, right? If I mentioned Breakaway Bikes, and we at the time really couldn't afford that investment to buy a building and outfit it and get it going. I had to rely on relationships, ask favors, right? There's always this give and take and trying to balance that out and plan it. So with every goal that you set, I think it's important to really try to break down all the pieces that are going to help you get there. I still, coach some riders, not a lot anymore. It's not like my true profession, but there's some people I like working with, and trying to have that conversation, because there's, the first thing that comes to mind when you're coaching riders that have careers, and that's where I, have always enjoyed spending my time. I'd like to work with people that are like me, right? We're working, we like this hobby, and we're going to do it and want to do it well. But talking about some of those things that they're going to need to invest in, and what's that going to take away from other aspects of life. They're willing to do it, be open about it, include it in your relationship. I think there was times where I didn't necessarily do that with my wife, and now I've learned to be much more honest about what the true commitment of any kind of goal you're going after is, and how it impacts everyone around you.
As I'm thinking through this theme of investment that we're talking about, what you're doing is putting the cards on the table so that you're not coming up against friction in your relationship when you're training 15 hours a week instead of 8, and that I think inherently just takes some of the problematic aspects out of it and lets you approach it in a more responsible, considered way. So I think that makes a ton of sense.
I wanted to pull on Joe is kind of this champion's mindset that I think you described when you had that bottle in the fridge that you were going to drink after your first crit win, or then your first United States championship, and then your first world championship. In business too, like you set a goal, but that goal is a short-term goal. And when you get there, having that feeling of like temporary satisfaction, but the overwhelming feeling of like knowing what's next, and constantly chasing the next higher opportunity, and sort of falling in love with the process rather than the outcome is something that was an aha moment for me when you described it.
Yeah, it's true. I think if there's any wisdom that I've gained too is to, while I still think goals are extremely important, personally, I've tried not to let them control me as much as I want to control them, right? So when you think about what you are willing to do to get to that goal, I think it helps you control the goal rather than the goal controlling you. And if you don't lay that out in advance, you can find yourself spinning out of control to go after something that you really didn't put the plan in.
Sacrificing too much, right?
Yeah. Then it truly does become a sacrifice, right? At that point versus investment.
Joe, thank you for spending so much time with us. We have learned a thing or two. Trust us, Joe. So thanks for sharing your insight and experience. And without further ado, why don't we go to our first lightning round of questions? We're putting Joe on the spot here with a bunch of questions, not so much related to bikes and stuff. So Franco, please take it away.
Okay, so these have no sort of rhyme or reason or order, so it might be a bit jolty, but let's see. We'll start with, Joe, what book are you reading right now?
Oh, yeah, I'm reading Ben Franklin's biography by Isaac Newton.
Walter Isaacson.
Walter Isaacson.
One of my favorite books.
Yeah.
A great Philadelphian.
A great Philadelphian, apropos with our kind of political climate that we're going through now, to get a hard reset on what our founders really had in mind at the time. And it had sat on my bookshelf for a long time. It's a thick book. And I did read the Einstein biography by Walter Isaacson a few years ago, which is, again, for me, I'll say they're ambitious reads because they're like this.
Yeah.
But I read a book over the summer called A Little Life, which was just an emotionally deep book and great read. But it was also a really ambitious read. And I thought, all right, I did that. I'm going to go for this Ben Franklin that's been sitting on my shelf for a while.
That's a great answer. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. What is your favorite sport to watch?
Oh, that's a good question. All right. So my son's rowing at St. Joe's right now. He's a rower. So I got to say that's one of my favorite things to watch today. And cycling, so much fun in person because of the party, so much better on TV because of you actually can see the race going on. And then football, because I just have so much knowledge on the sport. that watching and when I got done playing, I didn't watch it for a decade because we had watched so much game film and I couldn't watch it. And so enjoying it. And I live in a great professional football city with the Eagles. And so they're, fun to watch when they're not infuriating me.
Okay. So this jumps off that. What is the best thing about Philadelphia?
Man, gosh, I don't know that everyone can appreciate this, but Philadelphia is just a gritty city. And we now have a gritty mascot, but it's, I like that. I mean, I grew up in a small town, blue collar, hardworking town, and to move into a big city when I was, in formidable years and, Philadelphia, large city, to have one that is kind of filled with people that are kind of cut from that cloth, I think makes it just a perfect city for me to be in and spend time in.
All right. What is the best advice that you've ever received?
Wow, that's a good question. The best advice I'd ever received. Oh, well, I'm going to have to go back to Ed Denton, my high school football coach that told me to, play football. And, after I played for a little while under him, he said, you should go to college. You could get a scholarship doing this. Like I said, that was probably the best advice.
That's awesome. What's one habit you're trying to build or break right now?
I'm trying to break a sweets habit after dinner right now.
Timely with Halloween being yesterday. I certainly ate plenty of sweets after dinner, I would say.
Well, also, what how do you categorize sweets?
I have a tendency to enjoy a little ice cream at the end of the day, and but I'm actually working on getting some better fitness back. So I've maintained exercise probably beyond what like most people do. I still ride, still do group rides, but I'd like to get back into a more competitive shape that I've not been in a few years.
Okay, so last one, Joe. What is a piece of advice that you'd give to an entrepreneur that is hesitant to make a big career pivot later in their career?
Believe in yourself, because that's going to help you take the leap, and it really is going to require a leap of faith, and you're going to feel like, it should feel like it's not an easy thing to do, but believe in yourself and take that step and trust that you have the skill set to work through whatever comes your way.
What a fantastic way to wrap.
Cheers,
Joe. That's awesome.
Yeah. Joe, thanks for spending almost 2 hours with us. Like I said, it's our pleasure. It's great to connect with you after sort of, maybe I met you once in person over the years, but with some distance between us, you in Philly, me in Austin. I'm really glad that you agreed to to come on the show, and just what a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Oh man, thank you, Sam. No, the pleasure's been all mine. Really getting to know you a little bit, and not nearly in the detail that you've gotten to know me. I'll have to come up with some questions the next time we talk. And Franco, great to meet you guys. Thank you. This was again such a pleasure. Appreciate it.